Nothing about that Wednesday felt like the kind of day that ends with your own grandson in handcuffs. I keep circling back to that. I'd had worse Wednesdays. I'd had a knee replaced on a Wednesday. This one just felt like laundry and a ball game on the radio, and maybe a walk if my hip cooperated. My name is Walter Kessler, 68 years old, 34 years running a cabinet shop off Route 9 outside Allentown, Pennsylvania, before I sold it to my foreman and let my body finally admit it was tired. I raised two kids alone in that town after my wife Carol passed of a stroke when they were still in grade school. I built half the kitchens in that county with my own two hands, and I built my children the same way: careful joints, load-bearing where it mattered, nothing that would come apart under pressure. Or so I believed. On the second Saturday of March, my son Gary called and asked if he could bring the family over for dinner. That's the whole of it. That's all it was supposed to be. Gary called me on the Thursday before, and I remember exactly where I was standing at the sink, rinsing out my coffee mug, looking through the window at the Hendersons' dog doing laps around their yard like it had somewhere to be. My phone buzzed on the counter. "Dad," Gary said, "you free Saturday? Denise wants to do a real family dinner. Pot roast, the works. Bring your appetite." I said, "Sure, of course, when have I ever turned down pot roast?" "Who's coming?" I asked. "Just us. And Marcus is staying with us for a while, so he'll be around too. Marcus is my grandson, 26, Gary's boy from his first marriage, sharp as a tack when he wants to be, and about as steady as a three-legged chair the rest of the time. He's between jobs," Gary added, a little too quickly, "the way you say something you don't want examined too closely." I told him that was fine. Family is family. I said I'd bring a pie. Welcome to Watching the Wolves. My friends, if you've never sat with me before, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight, because this one, I promise you, is going to take a turn you won't see coming. Saturday came up clear and cold, the kind of early spring day in eastern Pennsylvania where the sun tricks you into thinking it's warmer than it is. I baked a cherry pie that morning because it was Carol's recipe, and doing it kept my hands busy and my mind quiet the way it always has. I put on a clean flannel shirt, the good one without the paint on the cuff, and I drove my old Silverado out to Gary and Denise's place in Emmaus, about 20 minutes from my house on Chestnut Street. Their place is a two-story colonial they bought 8 years back, vinyl siding, a two-car garage, a mailbox shaped like a little red barn that Denise painted herself. Nice house. A house that says the people inside it are doing fine, even when they aren't. Marcus answered the door, before I'd even knocked, which struck me as a small thing at the time, and only later as anything but. "Grandpa," he said, and he hugged me, which Marcus does not typically do. Marcus shakes hands like he's closing a business deal, even with family. But that day he hugged me, and he took the pie out of my hands like it was something fragile, and he said, "We've been waiting on you." Denise came around the corner in an apron, hair pulled back, and she kissed my cheek and told me I looked good, which nobody has told me since about 1997. Gary was in the kitchen basting the roast, and he called out, "Hey, old man, grab a chair, we're just about ready." Everything smelled like garlic and rosemary and brown butter, and for a moment I stood in that doorway and thought, this is nice. This is exactly what a family is supposed to feel like on a Saturday. We sat in the living room for a while, before dinner, the television low, some basketball game neither of us was really watching. Marcus sat across from me, and I asked him how the job hunt was going, and he gave me some vague answer about a couple things in the pipeline that I recognized as the kind of answer you give when there's nothing in any pipeline at all. I didn't push. I've learned not to push young men about work. It humiliates them, and humiliated men get defensive, and I wasn't in the mood for defensive. About 20 minutes before Denise called us to the table, Marcus got up and went into the kitchen and came back with a small amber bottle, unmarked except for a plain white label with cursive lettering. "Hey, Grandpa," he said, holding it out to me like a peace offering. "I've been seeing this holistic guy downtown, works with a lot of guys my age on recovery and wellness stuff. He's got me on these mineral drops. Said with your joints, and how you mentioned your circulation being off last time we talked, it might really help you." I looked at the bottle. I looked at my grandson's face, open and earnest in a way I hadn't seen from him in a long while. "I'm not in the habit of taking things from a holistic guy I've never met, Marcus," I said, "but but not unkindly. Grandpa, it's just trace minerals and some kind of root extract, totally natural, no interactions with anything. I checked, because I know you're on your blood pressure pills. I wouldn't give you something that'd hurt you. He sat down on the arm of the couch next to me, and there was something in the way he said it, something that landed exactly where it was aimed, because I had mentioned my circulation to him. Weeks back, on the phone, just a passing comment about my feet falling asleep more than they used to. He'd remembered. My grandson, who I sometimes worried didn't listen to a word I said, had remembered a small complaint about my feet and gone out and found something for it. I felt, in that instant, something warm and unguarded open up in my chest. A few drops in something, I said. That's all it takes. Denise appeared in the doorway right then, apron off, carrying a glass of ginger ale, already poured, already waiting. I made you one, Walter. You won't even taste it. Marcus measured the drops out himself, slow and careful, counting under his breath. 9 of them. I watched him do it the way you watch anything domestic and unremarkable, without attaching any weight to it at all. Cheers, Grandpa, he said. Cheers, I said, and I drank it down. Dinner was every bit as good as it smelled. Denise's pot roast fell apart at the touch of a fork, carrots and little red potatoes soaked through with the drippings, a loaf of her sourdough still warm enough to steam when you tore it open. Gary opened a bottle of red he'd been saving, and we talked about the Phillies' chances this year, and about a fence Gary was thinking of putting up, and Marcus told a story about a guy he used to work with at the warehouse that had all of us laughing despite ourselves. It was, without exaggeration, one of the better family dinners I'd had in years. I remember thinking that. I remember being grateful for it. Somewhere between the second helping of potatoes and reaching for the bread basket, it found me. My mouth went dry all at once, dry in a way that had nothing to do with thirst, like something had reached in and shut a valve. I reached for my water glass and noticed my hand wasn't quite doing what I told it to, a half-second lag between the thought and the motion. A strange metallic taste crept along the back of my tongue, unpleasant and unmistakable. I set my fork down. The room hadn't moved, but something behind my eyes had tilted a few degrees off level. You all right, Dad? Gary asked from across the table. Fine, I said. Little warm in here, is all. I smiled at Denise. This roast is something else, Denise. I mean that. She beamed and thanked me, and I kept eating, kept talking. But the metallic taste didn't fade, and the tilt behind my eyes didn't level back out. It just kept quietly getting worse, the way water finds a crack in a foundation and doesn't stop until it's found the basement. Maybe I need some air, I thought. Maybe some water will settle it. Excuse me a minute, I said, folding my napkin. Going to get some water. I'll get it. Denise started to rise. No, sit, enjoy your dinner. I know where the sink is. The kitchen was cool and quiet after the warmth of the dining room, and I stood at the counter filling a glass, waiting for whatever this was to pass through me and be done. It didn't pass. I set the glass down too hard, and my hand, still not quite mine, caught the edge of a dish towel and sent it sliding off the counter, down into the gap between the cabinet and the trash bin. I bent to pick it up, and that's when I saw it, wedged back in the shadow where nobody standing upright would ever see it, a torn foil blister pack, crumpled, pushed back deliberately far. Someone in this house is sick, I thought. That was the whole of it, the only thought I had. A father's instinct, an old man's concern, wondering which one of them had been carrying something private and hadn't told the rest of us. I picked it up and turned it over in the light. The word printed across the foil in clinical block letters was one I didn't recognize, clonidine. I had no fear of the word itself, not at first. I was concerned the way any grandfather is concerned to learn somebody he loves is dealing with something alone. Gary had mentioned his blood pressure being up last year. I took out my phone right there at the sink and typed the name into the search bar to understand what I might be looking at, whether I should say something or leave well enough alone. The results loaded. I read the first one. Then I read it again, slower. Clonidine, combined with alcohol or in excess of prescribed dosage in elderly patients, may cause profound sedation, disorientation, memory impairment, and symptoms consistent with acute confusional states or early-onset dementia. I stood dead still in my son's kitchen, and let that sentence rearrange itself in front of me the way a bad seam reveals itself once you know to look for it. 9 drops, carefully counted. Denise already holding the glass before I'd even sat down. No, I told myself, no, that's not possible. That doesn't make any sense. But the room had tilted before I ever set foot in this kitchen, and I understood, standing there with the tap running and my hand shaking around a folded scrap of foil, that the tilt hadn't come from the wine, or a bug going around, or a tired old man's circulation. It had been sitting in my glass before I ever picked it up. I folded the blister pack and slid it into my shirt pocket, turned off the tap, picked up my water, and walked back into that dining room and sat down and smiled at my family and reached for the bread, and I said nothing at all, because I didn't know yet, not for certain. But something had shifted in that kitchen that I couldn't shift back into place. Before I left that night, Marcus pressed a fresh, factory-sealed bottle of the drops into my hands at the door. "Take it every day, Grandpa. You'll feel like a new man." I looked at my grandson's face, open and warm and smiling, and I searched it the way I used to search a plank for the hairline crack that would ruin the whole cut. "I will," I said. "Thank you, son." I walked out to the Silverado and sat behind the wheel in the dark for a long moment before I turned the key. Maybe it's nothing, I told myself. Maybe there's some reasonable explanation I haven't thought of. I drove home to Chestnut Street and sat at my own kitchen table and looked at that blister pack under the light for the better part of an hour. Then I picked up the phone. Not because I was sure, because I needed to be. There's a moment in a man's life when the floor under him gives way, and nothing on the other side of that moment looks the way it used to. Mine came at 11:30 that same night, sitting alone at my kitchen table with the porch light throwing a long yellow rectangle across the linoleum. I hadn't touched the sealed bottle. It sat in the center of the table like an exhibit nobody had labeled yet. I'd read everything the internet had on clonidine toxicity by then pharmacology forums, a geriatric medicine paper I had to read twice with a second tab open just to decode the terms. I ran a cabinet shop for 34 years. When a joint doesn't sit right, you don't paint over it and hope. You pull it apart and find where the wood failed. What I found here had no good grain in it anywhere. Clonidine wasn't some root extract. It was a prescription blood pressure medication, narrow and dangerous outside its intended dose, and in no version of any world was it an ingredient in a holistic wellness supplement handed to a 68-year-old man over pot roast. Maybe it's a bad batch, the reasonable part of me kept insisting. Maybe it's mislabeled. Maybe whoever dropped that packet has a prescription of their own, and this whole thing is an ugly coincidence. I wanted that to be true, more than I have wanted almost anything in my life. But the part of me that spent 3 decades reading load-bearing math kept snagging on one detail. 9 drops, carefully counted. Denise's glass already poured and waiting before I ever sat down. I picked up my phone and called my daughter. My daughter Nicole lives in Pittsburgh, 190 miles west, 31 years old and a paralegal for a firm that specializes in elder law, sharp in a way that used to make her mother laugh and now just makes strangers underestimate her at their own risk. She and Gary hadn't spoken in almost 4 years, not since a fight over Carol's wedding ring that Gary had promised her and then somehow misplaced after his second marriage. I'd always suspected there was more to that story than either of them told me. Nicole and I kept our relationship going quietly underneath the fracture. Sunday calls, a visit twice a year when Gary wasn't around, careful not to make either of them feel like they'd lost. She never once asked me to choose sides. Calling her past midnight about her brother felt like crossing a line I'd sworn I never would. I crossed it anyway. She picked up on the second ring, already alert Nicole does not do groggy, never has. "Dad, it's almost midnight. What's wrong?" I told her to listen all the way through before she said a word, and she went quiet and let me talk. I told her everything, the phone call from Gary, the dinner, the amber bottle, Marcus counting 9 drops into a glass Denise had already poured, the dry mouth, the metallic taste, the room tilting in a way that had nothing to do with the wine, the dish towel falling, the gap behind the trash bin, the blister pack, the search results glowing on my phone at the sink with the tap still running. I told her about the sealed bottle Marcus had pressed into my hands at the door with that warm, earnest smile. I talked for nearly 10 minutes straight. When I finished, the line went so quiet, I checked the screen to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Dad, I'm here," she finally said, and her voice had changed, gone still, in a way I recognized from when she was 17, and found out her debate coach had been padding his own expense reports. She'd taken him apart with nothing but photocopies and a calm, level voice, and the man resigned within the month. That same stillness now. "Don't touch that bottle again," she said. "I haven't. It's sealed, still factory sealed." "Good. I need you to overnight it to me first thing in the morning, along with the blister pack, FedEx, not the post office. There's a place on Hamilton that opens at 8. Nicole, it's Sunday tomorrow. Some of those places don't open on Sundays out here." A pause. "Then Monday, first thing. Pay in cash. And Dad, don't put your own name on the return address." That last sentence landed differently than everything before it, because that wasn't a daughter being cautious. That was somebody treating this like evidence. "What are you thinking?" I asked, though some part of me already didn't want the whole answer yet. "I'm thinking I need to know exactly what's in that bottle before either of us says another word to your son. Can you do what I'm asking?" "Yes." "Get some sleep. I'll call you at 7. She called at 6:51. I drove to the FedEx on Hamilton Street Monday morning at 8:15, the sky the flat gray of early March, the sidewalk still salted from the last cold snap. I'd sealed the blister pack in a sandwich bag and wrapped the bottle in a dish towel, inside a padded envelope, taped it shut myself. For the return address, I used my neighbor Dale Fenner, a retired mail carrier 2 houses down who owed me for a porch rail I'd fixed for him free of charge the summer before. Dale didn't ask a single question, God bless him. I paid cash and watched the envelope disappear behind the counter, and then I stood on that cold sidewalk for a full minute afterward, hands in my coat pockets, looking up at that flat gray sky and asking myself what exactly I thought I was doing. This is my son's family. This is Marcus, who used to fall asleep in my truck on the way home from the lake. I gave myself 60 seconds to hope I was just a tired old man who'd read too many pharmacology forums at midnight. Then I got in the truck and drove home. 4 days later, a Thursday, I was sitting in my recliner pretending to read the newspaper, having read the same headline about a county zoning dispute maybe a dozen times without absorbing a single word of it. My phone rang at 10 after 10. "The lab results are back," Nicole said. No hello. No lead up. I set the paper down. "All ready." I called in a favor. "There's an independent toxicology lab our firm uses for contested cases. They owed me." A breath. "Dad, I need you to stay calm while I tell you this." I was already not calm. "Just tell me." "The sealed bottle. Factory packaged, sealed, everything intact. It's laced with clonidine, concentrated well above any prescribed therapeutic dose." She paused, and I could hear paper shuffling on her end. "The toxicologist's note, and I'm reading you the exact wording, says findings consistent with deliberate administration for the purpose of inducing cognitive impairment." The living room went so quiet, I could hear the refrigerator cycling on in the kitchen. "Deliberate administration. How concentrated?" I asked. "Because I am a man who built cabinets to a 16th of an inch for 34 years, and I needed the exact number, even knowing the number was going to gut me. Concentrated enough that daily use, the way Marcus instructed you to take it, would produce cumulative sedation and disorientation severe enough that anyone watching you over 2 or 3 weeks would document what looked like the early stages of dementia." Short sentences. My mind had stopped being able to hold on to longer ones. "They needed me to look like I was losing my mind," I said. "They needed documentation," Nicole said. "Medical, behavioral, witnessed by people who'd swear to it in a courtroom. I also pulled the deed records on your house on Chestnut Street through the Lehigh County Recorder's office. Somebody requested a certified valuation and full title search on your property back in January. It wasn't a bank, Dad. It came from a law office in Bethlehem, a man named Gerald Fitch." A pause that felt like standing at the edge of a roof with no rail. "I called a colleague who handles elder guardianship cases. Fitch has a name for himself in certain circles. He finds families with an aging parent and real assets, coaches the family on how to build a paper trail of concerning behavior, and keeps a guardianship petition drafted and ready in a drawer, just waiting for a medical crisis or a bad cognitive evaluation to trigger it. The moment you stumble, they file. A judge signs off, and everything you own goes under someone else's control. My house, my shop, sold, but the proceeds still sitting untouched in a money market account. Carol's life insurance, which I'd never spent a dime of in 22 years because it felt like spending her, somewhere north of $2 million, conservatively. My grandson looked at his 68-year-old grandfather and saw $2 million. I sat in that recliner and felt something move through my chest that didn't have rage in it at all. Rage is loud and it burns out fast. This was cold. This sat down and stayed. Gary signed it too, I said. It wasn't a question. Dad, Gary's name is on it as co-petitioner. I sat with that a long moment. My own son. Then, quieter. And Marcus. Marcus is listed as the one who'd be moving in permanently to provide daily care and oversight. Dad, that's not a grandson bringing his grandfather medicine. That's a job description they wrote for him. Over the following 12 days, Nicole built something I can only describe, even now, as a work of engineering. She had the toxicology report certified and court admissible, submitted the whole file, the blister pack, the sealed bottle, the full lab analysis to the Lehigh County District Attorney's Elder Abuse Unit. A detective named Carl Dembski was assigned, a patient, unhurried man who built a case the way I used to build a cabinet, joint by joint, checking every seam before moving to the next. She forwarded the deed inquiry, Fitch's involvement, the whole preparation timeline going back to January, to the DA's office directly. And then, almost as an afterthought while we cleaned up her printouts off my kitchen table past 1 in the morning, she mentioned she'd filed a formal ethics complaint with the state bar against Fitch himself, attaching the drafted guardianship petition as evidence of a documented pattern. That's not something they can just look away from, she said. It's a textbook predatory guardianship scheme on paper, with his own letterhead on it. I looked at my daughter across that table, ink-stained fingers, dark circles under her eyes, and I understood in that moment that I had raised 2 entirely different people out of the same house, and only one of them had ever, once, looked at me and thought of anything besides what I was worth. I kept taking my calls from Marcus like nothing had changed. Every few days he'd check in, "You taking your drops, Grandpa?" Every day, I told him, right on schedule. And let him believe it, because he had badly, catastrophically misjudged who raised his father, and who his father had, in turn, raised. The morning we moved, I woke at 5:45 and made coffee, and stood at my kitchen window looking out at Chestnut Street going gray to blue in the early light. Nicole had been staying in my guest room for 11 straight nights by then, up late every night with her laptop and her red pen and stacks of folders that had taken over the whole left side of my table. She was already awake when I came downstairs, hair loose, both hands wrapped around a mug, and she looked up at me steady as a level and asked, "You ready?" "More than," I said, and sat down across from her. "Dembski's ready to move today. I'll call Gary at 9. Tell him you need to sit down about some estate paperwork your accountant flagged." I kept my voice a little unsteady on the call, a little slow, the voice of a confused old man trying to sort out something administrative. Gary agreed before I'd even finished the sentence. Of course he did. As far as he knew, everything he'd been building toward for months was standing on his own front porch 3 weeks early. I dressed carefully that afternoon, my good flannel, the clean one, my canvas jacket. I stood at my bathroom mirror a moment and looked at the man looking back at me and straightened my collar and walked out the door. Nicole left an hour ahead of me in her rental car. 2 stops to make, she said, and didn't say more, and I didn't ask. I arrived at Gary and Denise's at 2 o'clock sharp. Denise opened the door before I'd even knocked, wide smile, already watching for my truck through the front window. "Walter, come in. Come in. Can I get you anything?" Not even a flicker in her face. Gary and Marcus were in the living room, and both of them stood when I came in, that same careful, attentive courtesy I now understood for exactly what it was, not respect, management, the particular gentleness you show something you're waiting to collect on. "Dad, sit down, sit down. In a minute," I said, and I looked around that living room, the same stage tidiness I remembered from before, and I checked my watch. 1:58. 2 minutes. "So," Gary said, settling into his recliner with the loose comfort of a man who thought he was holding every card in the deck, "what'd the accountant find?" I looked at my son, 42 years old, the boy I'd taught to swing a hammer in the garage on Chestnut Street before he could ride a 2-wheeler. She flagged everything I told her to. I said. A small silence. She? The doorbell rang. I watched my son's face while my daughter walked through his front door. I've seen a few things in 68 years worth remembering the day each of my kids was born. A sunrise over the Lehigh Valley from a scaffold in 1979 that I still think about sometimes. This belonged right up there with them. Gary's smile didn't collapse all at once. It went in stages, like a house losing power room by room. First his eyes changed, then the corners of his mouth let go, then his jaw slackened before some old instinct caught it and pulled it back up. Denise made a sound behind him that wasn't a word at all. Marcus stood up off the couch and then sat right back down. Nicole walked into that living room like she owned every square foot of the floor under her dark coat, a leather folder under one arm, the total composure of somebody who had been rehearsing this exact moment for 12 straight days. She came and stood beside me and looked across the room at her brother with an expression that had nothing warm left in it whatsoever. Gary, she said. Just his name, laid down like a period at the end of a very long sentence. What, Dad? What is this? Gary said, looking from her to me and back. She's a paralegal, I said. And your sister. Both of those things, same as always. Looks like you forgot the second one. Nicole set her folder on the coffee table and opened it. You're out hurrying. No theater to it at all. Just the clean, practiced efficiency of somebody who had done this before and expected to do it again. The room was so quiet I could hear the furnace kick on somewhere in the walls. First document, she said, her voice flat and even as a plumb line. Certified toxicology results confirming the sealed bottle given to my father contains clonidine, well above any therapeutic dose. Consistent, in the lab's own language, with deliberate administration to induce cognitive impairment. She set down a second page. Second document. A mental competency and guardianship petition drafted by Gerald Fitch of Bethlehem, naming Marcus as primary in-home caregiver and Gary as financial conservator, with a preparation timeline going back to January. She let that sit. Third document. A court-ordered independent cognitive evaluation completed this past Tuesday by Dr. Ellen Marsh at Lehigh Valley Neurology, confirming my father's full and unimpaired competency. She looked up, moved her eyes slowly from Gary to Denise to Marcus. So, to be plain about what happened here, you poisoned a fully competent man, staged the appearance of his decline to build a fraudulent medical record, and put your own names in writing on the financial motive for doing it. A beat. That's not a mistake. That's a plan. And we built one right back. Gary stood up. Nicole, everybody just calm down. This is... Sit down, Gary, I said, and something in my own voice surprised even me, because he sat. I want a lawyer, he said, and something had already gone out of him. The easy confidence hollowed clean through, and what was underneath it looked smaller than I'd expected, younger. First smart thing you've said since March, Nicole told him. I'd strongly recommend it. She glanced at me and gave the smallest nod, and I took out my phone and called Detective Dembski. He picked up on the first ring. Mr. Kessler? We're ready, I said. They came in 2 plain sedans, no lights, no sirens, just 4 officers, and the kind of unhurried procedure that told you they'd done this enough times to know that quiet cost more than noise ever could. Dembski introduced himself at the door and walked into that living room like he had all afternoon to spend there. Denise started crying the moment he began reading out the charges, not the composed, managed tears I'd seen out of her before, real crying. The kind that comes when a lie finally gives out all at once and there's nothing left holding a face together. Marcus wouldn't look at me at all, staring at the carpet, hands gone very still on his own knees. Gary said nothing while Dembski spoke, and I understood from the particular shape of his silence that he'd already thought through this exact moment once before, already decided what not to say if it ever came. He'd planned for the possibility of getting caught. That single detail cost me something I don't think I'll ever entirely get back. The cuffs came out, and that's when Gary looked up, not at Nicole, not at Dembski, at me. Dad. His voice broke clean in half on the one word. I don't know what made me ask it. Maybe 34 years of needing to know exactly where a seam had failed and why. Why? I said. Just the one word. The room went completely still, and my 42-year-old son, standing in his own living room, with an officer's hand on his arm, started to cry, ugly and unguarded, a grown man coming apart all at once. I didn't mean for it to go this far, Dad. I swear to God. He wiped his face with the back of his wrist. The garage, I put everything into a second shop out past Makunji, and it went under, and I owe people money. I don't have real money, and Marcus, he glanced at his son, who still hadn't lifted his eyes off the carpet. Marcus came to me back in January. Said he'd found a guy, Fitch, said there was a way through it. I told him no. I told him absolutely not. But you did it anyway, I said. Denise. His voice dropped almost to nothing. Denise said it wasn't really hurting you. Said you were 68 and you'd end up needing full-time care in a few years regardless. Or, he couldn't finish it. I looked at Denise. Both her hands were pressed over her mouth, tears running quiet down her face, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. He was old, he was going to end up in a home or dead eventually anyway, so it wasn't really wrong. That was the arithmetic they'd worked out on what was left of my life. Look at me, Gary, I said. And he did. You sat across that table from me. You watched your own boy count out 9 drops into a glass your wife already had waiting. You watched me get sick, and the two of you traded a look right over the potatoes like nothing was happening at all. And then you stood at that door and put a fresh bottle of it in my hands and told me to take it every single day. My voice stayed level. It surprised me how level it stayed. That's not a man who made one bad call under pressure. That's a plan, and you're going to own it as one. He couldn't answer me, crying too hard by then to get a word out. I turned to Dembski. I'm done here, I said. Gary Kessler, Denise Kessler, and Marcus Kessler were each charged with felony neglect and financial exploitation of an older adult, criminal conspiracy, and administering a controlled substance without consent under Pennsylvania's elder abuse statutes. Gerald Fitch was referred to the State Disciplinary Board and disbarred, pending a separate criminal investigation into what turned out to be a pattern going back at least 6 years. Once the house had emptied out, it was just Nicole and me standing in that quiet living room, the smell of somebody's abandoned dinner still hanging faintly in the air from the kitchen. I walked over to the front window and looked out at the street, bare trees, that same flat gray sky, going toward evening now. 3 weeks earlier, I'd parked my truck right out there on that curb, carrying a cherry pie, genuinely glad to be coming to dinner. Nicole came and stood beside me. Your accounts, your house, all of it, I already had the paperwork filed to protect everything the moment the lab results came back, she said quietly. It's yours, Dad. Every bit of it, every decision, start to finish. I need you to hear that clearly. I told her I already knew that. I had always known that about her. It was the whole difference between my 2 children. One of them had looked at their father across a dinner table and seen a father. The other had looked at the same man and seen a balance sheet. Let's get out of here, she said. There's a diner on Hamilton does a meatloaf that'll make you forget you ever left Pennsylvania for Pittsburgh. I told her, and she laughed, full and unguarded, a sound I hadn't heard nearly enough of in 4 years, and it landed somewhere in me that had been empty a long while. Lead the way, old man, she said. I smiled and walked down the steps ahead of her into the cold. The case went to trial that following fall. I sat in the Lehigh County Courthouse in my good flannel and my canvas jacket on the day of sentencing and listened to a judge lay it out in plain, careful language. What was done to Walter Kessler, she said, was not a family disagreement. It was a crime committed with premeditation against a man who trusted the people who committed it. Gary received 3 years. Denise, 2.5. Marcus, 18 months. The judge noting his age and his father's influence, though I noticed she didn't let it excuse him. Fitch was still facing his own proceedings separately. I didn't walk out of that courthouse feeling any kind of victory, and I want to be honest with you about that, because you've stayed with me this long, and you deserve the truth of it. You do not feel triumphant watching your own son led out of a courtroom. You feel the weight of every birthday, every Sunday dinner, every year you handed him without once suspecting what he was capable of. But underneath all that weight, solid and steady, I felt something else too, clarity. The particular kind of clarity that only comes to a man who has finally, completely stopped being lied to. Like a fever breaking after a long night. Like setting down something heavy you'd carried so long you'd forgotten it was never supposed to be yours in the first place. If this story found its way to you tonight, Do me a favor and share it with somebody who needs to hear it. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me down in the comments where you're listening from. I read every single one. I'll see you next time, friend.